I'm Laura London, and this is a special video edition of Speaking of Jung. Joining us today for episode 132 is Jungian analyst and physicist Dr. Robert Matthews in Adelaide, Australia. He holds a Ph.D. in theoretical physics from the Flinders University of South Australia, where he worked in research for many years. He later went on to earn a graduate diploma in education from the University of Adelaide, and since 2003 has worked as a senior lecturer in their School of Education. In 2007, he received a Diploma of Counselling and Communications from Kranz International College and began training as a Jungian analyst, later earning a Diploma of Analytical Psychology from the Research and Training Center for Depth Psychology, according to C.G. Jung and Marie-Louise von Franz in Zürich. Dr. Matthews worked as a physics and mathematics teacher and curriculum writer for the Australian Science and Mathematics School and has lectured on Jung and religion at the University of South Australia and on neuroscience and education at the University of Canberra. Since 2015, he has served as president of the C.G. Jung Society of South Australia, and recently he presented Unifying Depth Psychology and Physics for the Pacifica Graduate Institute in California and Union of the Imaginary and the Real at the Psychology Club in Zurich. His book chapters include Teaching Out of the Unconscious, the Role of Shadow and Archetype in The Seeker, Papers in Honor of John P. Kieves, a depth psychology account of the creative imagination, applying the psychology of Carl Jung in Imagination in Educational Theory and Practice, and on Freud and Jung in Stephen Stoltz's new book, The Body, Embodiment, and Education. Dr. Matthews is the author of The Paradoxical Meeting of Depth Psychology and Physics, Reflections on the Unification of Psyche and Matter, published by Routledge in 2022 as part of the Research in Analytical Psychology and Jungian Studies book series under Professor Andrew Samuels. Other titles in the series include Jung's Reception of Picasso and Abstract Art, Jung, Dante, and the Making of the Red Book, and Alchemy, Jung, and Remedios Vero. My interest in Dr. Matthews' work began when I read these words in the preface to his book. He writes, "My first fascination was with the cosmos above, but fate had other ideas. It led me to a PhD not in astrophysics, but in solid-state physics. It was much later, after reading Alchemy, that I realized the two are one, that the starry firmament above is mirrored in the earth below. But no physics laboratories talk of such things anymore." You can help Speaking of Jung stay on the air by visiting our support page at speakingofjung.com/support, where you will find information on how to make a one-time or recurring donation, shop our Amazon storefront, register for online video courses, which now include the past 2 Jung Memorial Lectures by Donald Kalshed and Ann Ulanoff, as well as a new course by James Hollis, shop online using our discount codes, and interact with us on social media. And our Patreon should be going live sometime this month. Perks, there will be perks. Today's episode is made possible by Temenos Dream, the revolutionary new dream tracking app available for iOS and Android. Now you can record your dreams by speaking into your phone or typing them into the app. Keep your dreams organized, search the built-in symbol dictionary, and have AI illustrate and now interpret your dreams, all within the app. You can help support Speaking of Jung simply by downloading the app and creating a free account by clicking on the link in the description box below or on our website, speakingofjung.com, where you will find links to everything discussed in this episode in the show notes. This video interview is being recorded on Wednesday, February 7th, 2024, through the magic of StreamYard. Hi, Dr. Matthews.
Hello, Laura. How are you?
I'm doing really well. How are you today?
Yeah, very good. And thank you for that introduction. And thank you for all you do for the Speaking of Jung listeners. I know a lot of people appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for saying that. We are still here, almost 9 years now. And I really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. I know it's kind of late there in Australia. It's very early here in Chicago. And we've had a little bit of a technical glitch, which we're kind of chalking off to the Pauli effect. But here we go. So I don't think I told you this in our correspondence, but basically your book is about what you call the ring I, or the ring E. And I don't know if you noticed, and you can see right up here, the new Speaking of Jung logo. It's relatively new, about a year old. I chose this font because of the letter O in the word of that you see. Does that look familiar?
It just needs a little I and a little R written in there, and you've got the ring I.
Exactly, right. So I had been seeing that symbol. And when I took a tour of the psychology club in Zürich, which I know you've been to, I mentioned that you recently gave a talk there, in their library, I don't know if it's still there, but the red book, the copy of the red book that they have in the library that's in the glass case is open to page 127, which is the painting that Jung did of that symbol.
That's a gorgeous one, isn't it?
Yeah. So I was a little surprised to see that. I shouldn't have been in your book, and which we will get into. But I want to start at the beginning, which is how you are a physicist. You're a theoretical physicist, and now you're practicing as a Jungian analyst. So I'd like for you to share with us that road, that path that you took.
Of course. I'm not quite sure if I call myself a physicist anymore. I guess it's been a while since I was in the profession, but it's still it's still a part of me. So yes, I was first off in my 20s. It was physics that most interested me, and I was very keen to do a PhD, which I did. But I was exhausted at the end of it, I must say, as many people are when they finish their PhDs. And it's then that I kind of went wandering a little bit, and I took off and ended up somehow in Indonesia studying traditional music, of all things. And someone gave me this book of The Power of Myth by Joseph Campbell. And Campbell, of course, was... he well regarded Jung's psychology, and it was reading Campbell that I first came across Jung and started to get very interested. And then when I returned to Australia, I did return to physics off and on, but it never really satisfied me after that. There was something more I wanted, something that I didn't speak to, and it was much later that I realized that it was this whole inner life, this spiritual life that we've lost touch with. And that's what I was yearning for. But it took me a while more wandering. I did some sociology and philosophy and other things, and I could never find an anchor point in those subjects. They were intellectually interesting, but they didn't center me. They didn't put me in touch with my life as it seemed to be. And out of interest, I started Jungian analysis around that time. And that's what really keyed it for me. It was the very first session I remember. The fantastic woman, Ruth Fox. And about halfway through the session, it just hit me like one of those crystal clear thoughts that here is something that combined my interest in research alongside my interest in self-exploration and a spiritual life. And suddenly the two were offered together in this process. And it was then so clear that I should, if I wanted to do research in this area, I'd need to become an analyst as well. And so then became my search for where I should train and how I can do that, how I can afford to do that, as often is the problem. I then decided that how would I get to Switzerland to train? And I had the idea, if I'd trained as a teacher, then as a school teacher, then I could move to Switzerland or somewhere nearby with a job at a international school and finance myself to train. But during that time, the Australian and New Zealand organisation decided they would offer a new training, so I started with them, and I did that training for about 2 years. It was very interesting training. They wanted to do an eclectic offering where they would offer, if you know, there's an Andrew Samuels kind of classification of Jung approach, which is post-Jung, developmental Jung, and classical Jung. And they decided they would offer all three as the foundation for their training course. I did the first 2 years. I think they struggled a little bit to offer much in the classical area. They offered much more in the developmental, because a lot of the training analysts are out of the SAP in London, which is Fordham's school, which is a very developmental orientation. And so I was getting a bit dissatisfied. And then by chance, I met Frith Luton, who had just finished training at the Centrum in Switzerland. And in talking to her, I suddenly remembered a dream I had had, which spoke about me training a distance from Zurich, out where it would be affordable and where they would be close to the unconscious. That dream suddenly made sense, and I decided I would switch my training across to the Centrum in Switzerland, which I then did. And very early on, I realized that was the right choice, and I had some very supportive dreams that confirmed that here is where I'm going to find that research and that self-development interest that was awake in me.
Frith, you mentioned Frith Luton. She's been a guest on this podcast twice, and she's wonderful. We love her. And your story about paying attention to your dreams is a great example. Pay attention to your dreams. They're a guide, right? So let's talk about do you want to get into your new book? I say new because Amazon is listing it as being released in January. And you mentioned that the hardcover was published by Routledge in 2022, and this new release is the paperback edition, right? And what I noticed about that book is that I'm looking for it here, your dedication. You dedicated it to all your spiritual teachers, Carl Jung, Marie-Louise von Franz, and many others. So this is a spiritual journey for you, right? I mean, it's about physics and depth psychology, and that's what I want to get into with you. But how, and I guess you really did touch on that, how this was a spiritual journey for you.
Yeah, I guess that was maybe one of the reasons I felt more comfortable at the Centrum, because I think that's where they hold. The Centrum, maybe to explain a little bit, was set up by von Franz and analysts from the Jung Institute that went with her when there was some disagreements. I'm not exactly sure what they were, but von Franz left, and they set up in this new training. The structure was very similar to the Institute, same assessment process.
The Jung Institute, the CG Jung Institute in Zurich, now Kussnacht.
Yep. So being von Franz, who is, I think Jung says somewhere that she was the one that really understood his ideas, and and I think the Centrum, now von Franz is past, of course, but I think the Centrum's tried to hold to that conviction, that closeness of Jung's regard for the self and the autonomous psyche or objective psyche, and that's what they center around. And for me, that of course has a spiritual flavor to it. Certainly, it's a wholeness, a depth to it.
Would you share with the listeners who might be interested in doing this themselves your training at the Centrum, and that's short for the Center for, it's a long title.
It is, isn't it?
The Center for Research and Training for Depth Psychology, according to C.G. Jung and Marie-Louise von Franz. So living in Australia, how did you navigate that? And how many years did it take from start to finish?
Yeah, and it's coming out of Australia, it's not an easy path. And as I said before, in Adelaide, where I live, there's very few Jungian analysts, and there's so there's not the possibility to have too many conversations directly. And it was just by chance that I met Frith, and Frith gave me that idea. But before that, if Australia hadn't opened up, I would have probably gone to the CG Institute in Kuznacht, but and that could have been the right move as well. Who knows? But I think because of the internet now, and there's a lot more information available to try and find out what are the processes, what are the requirements. Of course, there's an analytic hours is the primary requirement to get into training, plus usually some form of tertiary study, and maybe a postgraduate level. The Australian training also wanted some kind of psychotherapeutic qualification, which is why I did the counselling qualification.
Yeah.
I think other places don't necessarily need that. And then it's, you contact these places, you find out, what time commitment is required. Some trainings have a block course structure, like the Institute and the Centrum, where you're there for 2-3 weeks, a block course, maybe 2 or 3 times a year. Other places like you to live in situ, live during a year or two. And I think ISAP, which is the other training centre in Switzerland, I think they still require people to live and be coming daily as part of the practice, at least initially in the training.
Yeah.
So it's different across the world now, and I know in America there's other possibilities as well, and there's so many trainings. Most of them sit under the IAAP, the Analytical Psychology governing body.
Yeah.
The Centrum doesn't. This is interesting that they've been offered to join the IAAP, but they refuse on the basis of they don't want to adopt a formal political ethics structure in place of the appealing to the self and to dreams as the guiding factor in making these sorts of judgments and decisions. And I think that's kind of, that gives you some hint of the flavor of the training at the Centrum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. So how long did it take you to complete your training? I bring that up and I ask you, I know that it's rather personal, but there's a lot of misunderstanding that I see about becoming a Jungian analyst, what it takes. And that's why I want my guests to talk about just what was involved with their training.
So in this instance, there were two block courses a year for each of 2 weeks that we attended. And so there's a lot of travel backwards and forth.
Mm-hmm.
People on average, I think, would spend about 6-7 years to finish their training, maybe a bit longer. I went a bit over that, and I was quite happy to. I was in no rush at all, and to finish. And for me, it was all part of the process, and as an organic process, and I didn't want to rush it until near the end, when I kind of, okay, that's enough is enough, and I need to get on and finish this and get the piece of paper. So that happened, and so I think a bit over 10 years for me, and that's not that unusual either, I would say, for some people.
Right.
But it's a huge investment.
I think it's great because it just goes to show how deep this work is and how much time it takes. And real change happens at depth, and it can't be done in 6 months or 2 years or even 5 years. So I applaud you for sticking with it and doing the work. So your book, was that your thesis?
Yes, it came out of the thesis I did as part of the training.
So let's talk about it, because it's such an interesting book and there's so much in here and I don't want to miss anything. You start by saying that projection on the stars above is breaking down, or actually has broken down. And that kind of sets the stage for me for this work. So what do you mean by that? Would you say a little bit more about that? Projection on the stars above is breaking down.
Sure. I think there's an old idea that has been a governing principle for many cultures, and it's this old idea that the heavens above and the order in the heavens above, so the way the gods move around, the planets move around, and the backdrop of the stars, and you can think a bit of astrology here if you like. That heavenly order is mirrored in the organization or the flow of life down on Earth. And so, as a lot of you would know, the Emerald Tablet, it introduces the above as above, so below, and so below as above. So the two mirror one another and inform one another. And that was, I was very interested, and here's my love of Joseph Campbell again. He identified that this is an essential quality that comes out of every city-state across the planet as they emerged, as far back as 3000 BC in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and then it's this idea of above and below spreads across through to Crete and Greece, and then into India, China, and then ultimately South America. They each had their own form of it, but it seems that as soon as you get as a larger population as a city, you need some kind of organizational archetypal symbol or structure to hold the chaos of the city together. And so the order of the above starts to become a guiding factor for below. Now, that lasted off and on till certainly through into the Renaissance for us. It waxed and waned as you go through the Middle Ages, but when certain texts from Arabia started coming in into the West in the 12th and 13th century, and certainly into the Renaissance, this became such a lived principle once again, and people were very, very aware that their life was a little microcosm of the big cosmic macrocosm up there, and the two were united. Now, I had what started the book was I had a dream which began in a physics laboratory, which was the kind of life down here, and then in a kind of a moment in the dream, it's called a moment of resonance, and the window to the laboratory suddenly appears. It was sealed before then, and I see the cosmos outside, And so I realized at the end, this dream was putting me back into this view of above and below having a connection, in the language of the dream, a resonance. Now, with the advance of modern science, that connection that has lived for so long and guided us for so long was dissolved. And so the heavens above, who, we know Mars is, the god of aggression and war and so on, or Aries if you prefer. And so all the planets have their cosmic meaning and inform and play a part and in our own psychic structure. Modern science was no longer interested in that. It became slowly interested in just, there's a material mass up there, a body, a planet. It has this motion around the sun, and there's no animation to it. It has no effect on our life, our psyche, our emotional state. And it's hard for us to think in these terms anymore, but these Renaissance people really believed that the flow of the stars above, the planets above, had such a visceral effect on the flow on our state of our mind, on the state of our emotions, etc. Now, Jung, of course, saw that one way of understanding this psychologically is that we're projecting our inner structure, our psychodynamics, our complexes, etc. We're projecting those into the heavens above, and so we're able to work our unconscious through this projection onto the heavens. That collapsed, and we no longer had that capacity to know ourselves. We could only know ourselves through this modern science of, we're a material thing, and we've got neural connections and so on and so on. But there's no means to come to terms with this spiritual side of us, this rich emotional side of us, our instinctual side, etc.
Could I just jump in here? I'd like to ask you, what do you think led to that collapse? You said that way of seeing things collapsed. Is that, yeah, do you know what precipitated that?
Jung thought that there was that time of the Renaissance was a time when all the focus of the medieval time, if you look at the Gothic cathedrals and etc., there were huge amounts of resources put into the vertical to reaching up to those heavenly bodies and ultimately to God. Something happened in the Renaissance, and it happened out of the depths in us. The word for it is an enantiodromia, which is a horrible Latin word that it means that there's a reversal in focus. And so everything that was vertically focused suddenly became horizontally focused. And we're not so much interested in God, but we're much more interested in man after this switch. Mm-hmm. And man takes, and Jung will talk about the medieval mandalas had God in the center of them, but the Renaissance and beyond had nothing in the center of them. There was just this question mark: what is now our center? And suddenly this interest, and you have art suddenly shifts, and you have realistic art, Da Vinci, and through the Renaissance and so on. So reality becomes primary, and you have mathematicians such as Kepler, Johannes Kepler, who was very aware of the above and below, but he became more interested in quantifying and describing the motion of the planets rather than using them to animate his lived life. And so gradually that movement, that focus into the horizontal, takes more and more root, and the connection with the cosmic powers is lost. And so initially, yes, Kepler was very much a Christian and had strong beliefs. Newton also, who continued this new science, it was an alchemist. So he also had both were alive for a time, but as the new science took more and more root, and quantification became more and more a focus, and we often lay blame at Descartes for this one, because Descartes came along and developed his Cartesian system, probably out of a dream that he had. And the Cartesian system is astounding because it allows you to map these horrible equations that terrified everyone at school. You can get those equations and you can put them onto a graph, and suddenly you've got geometry and algebra being expressed together, and you can hold physical processes on sheets of paper and diagrams and calculate them, and it takes off from there. And it becomes such a powerful vehicle for understanding and manipulating the processes of the physical world. And it just washes over these remnants of alchemy and these other things just drop away more and more through the 17th century. And by the 18th century, there's not that much left.
So in the book, one of the main points that you make is that Jung, you say, opened the door to 3 possible ways of renewal.
Excellent.
And
yes.
Yes. Would you like to get into that now? So to kind of the word renewal, why is the word renewal used here? Is it because of what you were just explaining and how we had sort of lost our way?
Yeah, exactly. So for Jung, I mean, we only have a psychology such as Jung's because we lost our projection onto the heavens above. And all of that, all of that value that we projected into the heavens, all that libido, that energy, it's kind of hard for us to really key into how much it was, but it was very strong. All that when you take away those religious forms, the energy then has to go somewhere, and it drops back down into the unconscious, and it activates something new. And I think partly what it activated was Jung's depth psychology. And so out of his psychology, then he's wondering, okay, so where are we today? If depth psychology is going to be the replacement of what we had previously, this above and below, the correspondence theory and other things, is it possible to find in this new scientific approach, this psychological approach, something that speaks to the same potency as the old correspondence idea? So he comes up, and it's remarkable what he did. I mean, he comes up with first the mandala symbol, and that's when he's working in 1917 in a prisoner of war camp, doing his experiment on mandalas, and it takes quite a few years, but he realizes the mandala is his expression of the microcosm, his expression of wholeness, his expression of his outer and inner world, and the current state that it's in. So it gives him the beginnings of this correspondence between inner and outer.
Okay, so the mandala is the first way. So we're talking about the 3 possible ways of renewal. The first one is the mandala.
Yes, exactly. And you've got a mandala symbol in your sign. Speaking of Jung, as you said before, the O of the of. And the 4-quarter mandala in the circle is probably the most common one, but there are many different forms of it. But for Jung, he realizes, especially, and it's the high point for him was the Liverpool dream, which is in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and that's where he really nails that. The mandala is, it is this total view of what my life is, not just my conscious perception, but the total view. And so it's a wholeness, and so that's where the unity, the complete, is restored for that aspect of what the mandala carries for each of us when we receive one. In that moment, in that snapshot, your wholeness, your unity is restored once again. Next, he's carrying this idea, which later turns into this notion of synchronicity. Mm-hmm. And that's an idea that was with him for a long part of his life, I think. And eventually, partly out of conversation with Wolfgang Pauli, the physicist, who we might talk a bit on later.
Yeah.
That helped him a lot to get the right terminology for this idea of synchronicity, which again is this moment in time where the inner and the outer become unified. And so you have an experience of something that goes on in the outside world, of an event, and the quality of it, the meaningfulness of it, coincides with something that's going on in your inner state, in a dream, or for example, and the two coincide in a meaningfulness. And when you have these synchronicities, if you have enough of them, they start to click, and you start to really, okay, there is really something here. But it takes a little bit of experience with them, because they're such a different way of seeing the world from the materialistic viewpoint. They're kind of much more like an old Chinese viewpoint. Mm. And so if you were from old China, you see the world synchronistically. That's how you understand events. And you would think our modern science and causality is a very strange thing indeed.
Right. And that's the second way. I just want to, for the listeners, the first is mandala. These are the three possible ways of renewal. The second is synchronicity.
Yes. And so the mandala gives you kind of a snapshot of your personal life. They can be cosmic mandalas, but they give you a facet. The synchronicity gives you, again, a moment in time. So it's only a momentary connection between the inner and outer. It's not a constant lived one. Right. Yeah, so Jung talks about them as creative moments, creative acts in time, because they're just around that instant. And maybe we'll give some examples if you like. Yeah. In a minute, but so there's not quite the full correspondence yet. And Jung had pondered this heavily, I think, especially near the end of his life. And he talks, and no doubt out of conversations with Pauli, and his feeling is that natural number is the one. That natural number is going to be the one that can show that there is an underlying bridge between the inner and the outer, so that the two reflect one another, not just as in synchronous moments, but in a broader way, in a more ordered way.
And that's three.
And that would be the third one.
That's the third way. Mm-hmm.
So natural number. Now, that one is very difficult to explain. And Jung didn't write too much about it because it was near the end of his life and he felt it was a bit too much. He wrote down a lot of notes. He gave it off to von Franz. Von Franz didn't really want to take it up because it's a big problem, but she did, and she did it great justice and produced a book, Number and Time. And there she lays out for the first four numbers how those numbers work in the outside world to order physical process, and also in different ways. So each number has its own characteristic quality, and that mirrors the same way we see number ordering psychic contents. So in the inner world, and for example, the three in a dream is usually it's a dynamic process that's unfolding in time. So if I see someone, a client, they have a 3 in the dream, I know that something's going to drive forward, drive ahead in a certain direction. 2, it's not. 2 is ambivalent, and it's not clear what path there will be. But 3, usually there is a dynamic there. Same thing in the outer world. If there's a 3 is a characteristic of a physical process, then that's going to be something that drives open in time. And I think just the passage of the flow of time, past, present, future, is our classification for that is perhaps one example that you can take. There are others in von Franz's book, if you're interested in this question. Now that 3rd way, the number, I think von Franz opened the door, but there's a huge amount of work to be done there. And for some reason, it hasn't attracted too much attention, and I'm not quite sure why not.
I agree. So let's get into quantum physics, quantum mechanics, because the title of your books, The Paradoxical Meeting, and we need to talk about paradox, The Paradoxical Meeting of Depth Psychology and Physics, Reflections on the Unification of Psyche and Matter. And you were just talking about number and whole number, and that being Jung's 3rd out of the 3 possible ways of renewal. You mentioned that classical physics operates at the level of the 3, but quantum mechanics at the level of the 4. And that was another, just as an aside, there's usually a connection between episodes that I do, and none of it's planned. I don't think I ever mentioned that before. I don't think I ever said that out loud. It's not planned. So the previous guest I had, Professor Paul Bishop at the University of Glasgow in Scotland, his book was Why Must the Third Become the Fourth, is the subtitle of the book that episode focused on. And now here in your book, you talk a lot about the 3 and the 4. So let's get into that. The problem of uniting psyche and matter. I'll let you take it away.
It's light material, isn't it?
Yes.
All right. The 3 and the 4, it comes out of, mostly for us, it comes from looking back through mythic writings, and particularly alchemy. And alchemy was very rich in this question of 3 and 4. Jung felt we come from a Trinitarian religion, Judeo-Christian.
Yeah.
This has a Trinity in it, and the missing 4th. If 3 gives you a dynamic surge in direction, but the 4 centers you back onto a living center that you can find relationship to. And so when you're in the 3, you're kind of, you're in motion, but you're not turning around a center. And for Jung, for individuation, for wholeness, many times he'll talk about you need this centering factor. You need to be turning around an anchor point within yourself if you're going to take this next step to individuation, which is why the 4 becomes such an important quality. Now, I think if you look at the way 19th century physics and Newtonian physics, we call it, classical physics, it's all about describing processes moving forward in time. And there's not a lot of question around, is there something we need to stop and consider and ponder? But when you get to quantum physics, suddenly consciousness hits a brick wall, because you're working with systems that you no longer know, or no longer can, you have to admit defeat, that you can't know what's going on within the system. All right, you can design an experiment, and that experiment will allow reality to reveal itself to you in certain ways, but you will never be able to isolate exactly what is going on in the experiment in any individual process. And so that grand hope of we can master all processes and know them, which is how they felt at the end of the 19th century, suddenly is defeated, and it's thrown into this kind of paradoxical chaos almost of sometimes it's a wave, sometimes it's a particle, depends on how we design the experiment. If we do the experiment often enough, then we start to get a statistical and predictive handle on what's going on. But the people that pioneered this, like Niels Bohr, who's his description of reality becomes one of reality appears to us as it chooses, not as we no longer know what reality is. We can only know the way we can only see it's the appearance of reality as it makes itself known to us. And so suddenly there's this unknown point integral into the understanding of the physical object. There's the bit we know, and then there's the bit we don't know, and we cannot know, and somehow we have to coexist and accept that's the way our conscious experience of these experiments leaves us feeling, leaves us the situation it leaves us in. Now that to me opens up this unknowable center that is potentially in there, and that's the same process we go through when we start to get to know the self. And the self is an unknowable center in our psyche. We can experience the way it meets us in our conscious encounter, but we can't know what is really going on in there. It's in the unconscious. We cannot see into the unconscious. We can only see the characteristic experiences that we might have when we interact with something that Jung called the self. So again, consciousness is left, I'm using the word defeated, but really, you could also say that consciousness then becomes open to the fact that it is living alongside a mystery. And if you accept that, then you now have a different way of being, which is a way of seeking relationship to that mystery. So 19th century physics, no mystery. Anything we don't know, we'll just work a bit harder and we'll know. And they talk about God of the gaps and so on. And so God exists in the gaps, but we'll resolve all the gaps one day, and then there's no need for God at all. Quantum physics, no, you cannot resolve those gaps. Those are essential. They're integral. And same with the Jung psychology. You cannot live purely out of your consciousness and be a whole being. You must instead start to find relationship to something deeper.
I'm just having an epiphany here. And these are concepts that I've been struggling with for years. And you just sort of kind of made it all make sense to me just now. And I just want to say as an aside, I don't know if I mentioned this at the beginning, but before Dr. Matthews and I started recording this morning, about a half an hour before our scheduled time, I noticed that my internet was out, and my internet never goes out. I live in Chicago, and I have this super fast Xfinity Wi-Fi, and I'm not even using a Wi-Fi connection. I'm using a desktop computer that's plugged right into the router. So it's a wired connection, and it was out, and there was a red light on my modem. I've had this modem for years. I've never seen a red light on it. So it got reset, and they told me it was back online and everything was working, but the red light was still there. And while you were just speaking, Dr. Matthews, explaining basically God and consciousness to me, it finally all makes sense to me now. The red light is now white. The red light is gone and it is white. And so I had a moment there, and everybody got to witness it, whether it was visible or not. But thank you for that. Yeah, because what I had in my notes that I'd heard you say is that quantum mechanics demands uncertainty in your worldview. There's an aspect of the unknowable in what you're doing. And I guess I always sort of knew all this, but I had never been able to articulate it. Certainly I can't myself. And just hear how you put it, it all just came together for me. So now the confrontation with paradox, is that basically what you were just explaining? This paradox?
It is. So this is this 3 and the 4. So this 4 level, the unknown is an integral part of your attitude. You accept that there is an unknown portion in your thinking, and then it becomes the unknown then becomes an active potential in your thinking. But and then we'll talk a bit more about the autonomous psyche maybe in a minute. But now, in order to hold on to that attitude of the unknown, it seems the way we are built, the way our consciousness works, is you need to adopt a paradoxical attitude to whatever it is you're looking at. So if it's in quantum physics, then perhaps it's wave and particle paradox, duality. But if you're looking at a self figure, a Buddha or Christ or someone, then again, it's a paradoxical attitude of, Buddha is everywhere and nowhere, or the oldest and the youngest, or the most powerful and the weakest, or all these antinomies. And if you read any of the religious literature, they'll always describe the Godhead in those sorts of terms, because you're dealing with something that is very meaningful, but ultimately unknowable. And to keep that in your mind, to keep the fullness of what you're looking at, and this is, then you need to hold some kind of paradox onto the object. If you go one side, as soon as you go one side and away from paradox, then you have a singular view, and it's, and you've destroyed whatever was there before. You've removed the unknown possibility from it, and all that is left is, it's that one side. And we could get onto American politics if you want at the moment.
No, please don't.
Because there's a terrible one-sidedness forming there.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's very dangerous, because then you, what you're actually doing effectively is taking the position of God. You think that you know what is going on there. And that's an inflation of the self that you've taken on into your conscious attitude. And that's, as a threeness, as a dynamic energy, that state of mind, that one-sidedness, is very useful. And it's not to be. I had a dream right near the end of when I was writing the book, and in the dream it showed that I need to respect both the 3 and the 4. That will cycle through during our everyday. And so that the capacity to act, you need to be able to do that as well. So you need a certain amount of threeness. You can't just sit there in ambiguity endlessly. You have to
right. Good point.
Move into that, whatever it is. So we need the threeness in our life too. But in that deeper picture, we need some relationship to a mystery, and that requires to hold that attitude onto a mystery. You have to have a paradoxical viewpoint. Alchemy is absolutely chock-a-block full of this, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners would be aware of that the Latin expression, the conjunctio oppositorum, conjunction of opposites.
Yeah.
That's how they see the that's the Godhead is a conjunction of opposites. It's Mercurius. It's the Philosopher's Stone. So all those ultimate goals or potencies that we draw meaning from, they can only be related to through this double-sided viewpoint. As soon as you go one-sided, if you think you know what God's will is, you're in trouble.
I can attest to that.
Yeah, that's when you make big mistakes. But if you keep an open, paradoxical view, and this opens up a really big step for Jung, which was the dark side of God, and the Book of Job, and these things that he went through and understood. And there he's always aware of these double-sidedness, so that he's never falling into a one, or he's trying not to fall into a one-sidedness. And then you're receptive. Then you can hear this soft messages from within, and you can move with them. But that's individuation. That takes quite a huge development of consciousness to achieve that. Mm-hmm. Or religious practice, if you're working as a religious life in Buddhism or Christianity, etc.
So just moving on in the interest of time, I wanted to ask you about Wolfgang Pauli, since he was a collaborator of Jung's. They worked together. Jung did not analyze him. I mean, there's a whole story of that is a whole other subject. And Pauli's dreams are absolutely fascinating. They're a lot has been written about his dreams, and hopefully they'll continue to be explored. But why I mentioned him here is that now I just lost it. Okay. Pauli linked physics with the collective unconscious, with the inner world. And I was wondering what you wanted to say about Pauli here for the listeners. I know that wasn't a great lead-in, but I'll let you take it.
No, you're fine. You mentioned the Pauli effect before. Maybe we should mention that briefly. Which is,
please.
He was very noted for being around laboratories when accidents happened. So he was a theoretical physicist. He didn't do any practical work in a lab. But when he did go into the laboratory, sometimes the machines would start to not work or explode or whatever. And this was often enough that the other physicists would tease him about the Pauli effect. But Richard Feynman apparently had a very similar reputation too, someone closer to your home. But Pauli, who is another theoretical physicist, and there's a story I was reading the other day where Pauli was good friends with Otto Stern, a physicist from Göttingen, Germany, and he destroyed his machine several times, or his presence coincided with the destruction of his machine. So,
and I'd like to ask you, as a Jungian analyst, what do you attribute that to? What's going on there?
All right. I'll finish. I'll tell the story, then I'll try and answer that.
Yeah.
And so Stern had forbade Pauli from coming into his labs. And then one day when Pauli was, it was apparently back in Zurich and Stern in Göttingen, and there was a big explosion of the equipment, and they joked to each other, well, at least Pauli wasn't here, so it's not the Pauli effect. And then later they find out that Pauli was in transit at the train station going from Zurich, and he was in Göttingen train station at the time of the explosion on his way to see Bohr in Denmark. And so wild. It makes you wonder.
Yeah.
Now, as to what's going on, we don't know. To a simple answer, we don't know. We know that there's a coincidence. We know that it's too often for chance event. we know that there's often a meaningfulness associated with these things. And so there's a phenomenon that Jung called synchronicity, but there's no causal mechanism for it. And so we can't actually track it back and piece apart the process, not at the moment anyway. If we try and do that, we usually end up in magical thinking, which is the old kind of medieval way of understanding these things.
Yeah.
What I think in Pauli's case, it's kind of a trickster synchronicity. So it's these quite destructive effects that are coming out. And so the meaning there is that's not so clear in the trickster events. You see them a lot in psychiatric clinics. Schizophrenics often have a lot of these sort of trickster events around them.
Yeah.
I've had a few enough in my time. I don't want any more. Maybe there's something that they could turn into a more constructive. Maybe if Pauli is too one-sided with his theoretician, you could guess, and he needs to come a little bit more into the experimental world, and then maybe something would shift in him. So maybe there's some meaning along those lines.
That's a very interesting point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's a destructive energy, and this is we know the unconscious is capable of these things.
Yep. So Pauli, and quantum mechanics and what is real. So I wanted to ask you about that. That came up in a previous episode that I did where I was frustrated. I got very frustrated with my guest because they were talking about the reality of the psyche, which we've all heard that story, von Franz and Jung talking about Jung's patient who said she had been on the moon. And Jung told von Franz she really was on the moon. And von Franz said, you mean she imagined she was on the moon? And Jung said, no, she really was on the moon, as an example of the reality of the psyche. And so today, in our world today, hearing stories, trying to speak a little generally here, hearing stories about people's experiences with phenomena, and they say these are real experiences and they have no evidence, they have no proof. So I'm now on this search for what is reality, what is real. If it didn't happen physically or in the physical dimension, or if somebody thinks it did, but they have no evidence that it did, I'd like to hear your thoughts about that.
It's a very deep question, and what you make me think of actually is Jung in the Red Book when he's interacting with Philemon and others, and he says, but you're just my imagination, aren't you? And they get irate and they say, no, we're real. And I imagine that's where he was first fully confronted with this problem of the reality of the psyche. Okay. And that these contents, whether it's, you can say it's a content out of madness. That's from an external position. You're making that judgment. But in that moment, engaged in the psyche, this thing is very real. And it's happening to you. And if you don't take that psychic content seriously, as in the Red Book, they said you're wrong. You must take us seriously. We are real. And I think I'm not conflating that with as a material real person, but as that has impact, and it's not just the impact it has. It's these things are objectively, psychically real. We don't know how much we can explain or give we're so used to giving physical, real pictures of things, aren't we?
Yeah.
But when you get into these inner figures, and they have reality, they have impact, they have autonomy, they have, you can lose touch with them for a year and come back and they're still there. We don't know what form of what medium they're persisting in, because we can't see into the unconscious. But it doesn't mean they're not a reality. And I think that's what Jung was confronted with.
Which makes it rather difficult so if we can look at it psychologically, the reality of the psyche when we're in analysis, but when we're in the everyday world, walking around and talking to people that not on a psychological level, right? Not analytically. And these people talk about these things as though they were quote unquote real. I don't know where I'm going with this. It's just,
it's so easy with, we can use these labels, like psychologically look at it and we think we know what we're talking about, but often we don't. It's just a few words that we picked up to make ourselves feel like we know what's going on. And on an experiential level, which is, I think, where Jung is really cutting edge in dealing with these inner figures, on that experience of what he's encountering, that they are real. They have real effects on him, and he has real effects on them. They change as well as we change in the interaction. And you can track these things. And if you read the Red Book, I mean, you can see that these things are a development of a real development of a psychodynamic. What the medium is in the unconscious, we don't know. But something clearly is real. Something is clearly going on. They're stable enough, they're consistent enough, they're changing, they change you, they have a viewpoint that has effect. We are just learning how to incorporate this other way of being into our life, because we've lived through projecting these figures into the outside world for millennia, and it's only with Jung and these new ways of doing things that we're starting to now do the more mystical route, and as a larger population take these things on directly and engage with them and try and understand them and try and see what they have for us and what we have for them. That's new as a psychology. It's radical.
That's brilliant. You put that brilliantly. Thank you for that. And that brings us to kind of the end here. We've been going for over an hour, and I think this is a good place for us to discuss what is in the conclusion of your book. Chapter 7, it's fascinating. That's earlier. I don't know, we can go longer if you'd like, because there's a lot we haven't covered. I'd kind of like to go.
I don't mind. I mean, we're kind of heading towards, with Pauli, we step into the UFO question a little bit, because that's maybe where we could go next. And that also finishes off the book, because that's the last bit that I talk about, was Jung's writings in that chapter on flying saucers, I think he called it, didn't he?
Yes, I would just like to mention, because I said chapter 7, I took so many notes from that chapter. It's titled Pauli's Fantasy of the Piano Lesson. And you bring up so many things, and you have so many wonderful quotes in that chapter. And I've been tweeting. I'll tweet some more from that chapter. And by the way, I had mentioned in the beginning that Speaking of Jung will be available on Patreon. And one of the tiers that we're going to offer is all of the preparation that I do, all of the notes that I'm looking at right here, a lot of it doesn't make it into the episode. And what I'm going to do for our Patreons is give them a copy of my notes, all of the prep work that I did for the episode, because as I said, there's a lot of information that doesn't make it into the episode. And I want that to be available to the listeners. So look forward to that. It should be going live sometime this month. So I just want you to be able to mention anything that we haven't gotten to before we get to the conclusion. Was there anything that you were hoping to discuss that I haven't brought up?
I think we're doing very well. I think the one point about Pauli is, and you've brought up this piano lesson fantasy.
Yeah.
So there was a question of, you know, how far did he really go in opening to this depth psychology? And what I would say is, Pauli's intention was to find a way of unifying. It's the same problem again, a way of unifying the inner and outer. But he was coming at it as a physicist, and of course Jung is coming at it as a depth psychologist. But the conversations that the two of them had are remarkable. I mean, they're incredible geniuses, both of them. And they're writing letters, they're sitting down, having all these conversations. I'd love to have heard the conversations, but all we have is the letters that mostly Pauli wrote to Jung. And that's in Adam and archetype. It's hard work, I'll warn you, but very profitable to find your way through that. And what Pauli ends up doing is he wants to find a neutral language between psychology and physics, between psyche and matter. So a unifying language that explains both sides. And I think that's how physicists think. They think in terms of wanting to explain the process and find a language that can explain both sides.
Yeah.
And I think that's where he heads. And Jung works closely with him in the conversations, nudging him along, I think. And in the end, Pauli realizes that it's actually it's a problem as much of individuation as anything. That in order to, you know, you can find these intellectual solutions to things, but that doesn't change, that doesn't transform you, that doesn't change you. And if you're going to heal, I mean, I think this is one of the major splits in our culture at the moment, is this inner and outer, this spiritual world and this material world, and the split between them. And, you know, for his merit, I mean, Pauli really wanted to do something to heal that split. And in the end, he realizes it's an individuation process as much as anything else. And so he himself has to heal the split within him. Then he might be able to add something that others might also find interesting as a way of healing that split. And that's a very different way for a physicist to think, that he must change his personality has to transform, and then he might heal this split. Then it's no longer a question of finding the neutral language so much, but a question of being able to suffer that tension between this split world enough, so that it might resolve. And he has a dream near the end of his work with Jung where he's told that he has to move from the letter V to the letter W. And V is, Jung interprets this as V is Roman numeral 5. And 5 as a number usually is a banal, it can be the quintessential, but usually it's a banal number of the 5 senses and 5 limbs and 4 limbs and a head. Kind of. So it's kind of it's a very physical, it's a very extroverted number often. Whereas the W, Jung interprets as a V and another V, so double V. And that would be 5 and 5, which makes 10. And 10 brings you up to the 5 of the inner world and the 5 of the outer world. You've now got the two coming together in a wholeness. And there's a I think it's one of the most remarkable letters that Jung writes. And he says, we exist in a split world because that is the way our current zeitgeist is constructed. We can't avoid it. We live split between inner and outer. The man that sees from the 10 is the one, or the woman, is the one who has healed that split within themselves. And so they can see either outside or within. So they know there's these two viewpoints, but underneath that, they've achieved a wholeness, a unification. So, and I think, so Jung's telling Pauli he is on the way to individuating and healing that split within himself, but it will take time. Then maybe, then he maybe say something that others go, well, that's really good, and that opens the door for me a little bit as well.
Yeah.
And that could be the, yeah. So that was where I was heading for the, and the final thing I'd say is, then Jung writes in his work on UFOs, and he writes about how there's kind of a, they're living in the Cold War situation in the 50s. There's a real heightened sense of tension, and the threat of nuclear war and so on. And he's saying, I don't know if UFOs are real. He's fascinated by the possibility, but he doesn't know. But what psychologically, the way it's spreading across the world and gripping people's fascination so deeply, he knows that there's a projection going on as well. And he identifies that it's a projection of the self, that which is often what happens when the world is fragmented and fractured, or in great anxiety, is when these healing symbols of mandalas come into people's dreams. And Jung's wondering if this is what's going on across the world, that there's such a distress at the moment that this projection is being activated, and these self figures are coming to hold people and to order them. And I'll tell you a dream I had, because it was just prior to, I won't do the whole dream, it's too long, but just prior to Russia going into the Ukraine. And so I had no notion of what was about to happen. And I had a dream where I'm in an underground bunker and there's Russian soldiers working away, and they're working on I work out this is a space viewing place, and they have these radar, very old-fashioned, the old radar with the little thing that goes around and there's little blips.
The rings, yeah.
And they're looking at this radar map in their old equipment, and it's of outer space that this radar is of. And for them, it's a very precious, and I go to touch it and they stop me and they say, no, this is a very precious mandala. You can't stop it. You can't touch it. So be very careful with it or you'll disturb it. And then they take me over to a table, and at this table, they have all these most toxic chemicals you could imagine. So cancerous tissue and, poisons and all sorts of, all the nasties. And they say, what we're doing is we're extracting the essence from all of these, because that will be where the healing comes from.
Wow.
And so this is how the unconscious views what we see is horrific and a war and it's all that and et cetera, and it's terribly split. The unconscious sees this as this potential for wholeness. And there's and what is the darkest in our lives is where the healing factor will come from.
Yeah.
If we can, and we need not to disturb that. And that dream was consoling, and it gave me hope. And that's how the unconscious to me was seeing it was also a little bit of a comment on the UFO problem, because we're back now at a time when things are fracturing a lot.
Yes.
The resurgence in the UFOs has also come. And I make no comment on, there's a lot of stories that have a lot of substance to them, and I'm no comment there. But as something else that's moving in the background of our psyches, that is attempting to bring us whole and heal in the face of this terrible ripping apart, that is also happening.
It's attempting to make us whole and heal.
Yep.
I'm just writing that down. That was so beautifully put. I really appreciate that because it is an interest of mine, and we have a lot of viewers that are part of the UFO community. And I just want to let them know that in the last chapter of your book, which is titled In Conclusion, Resolving the Split Worldview, you mention Jung's writings on the UFO phenomenon, his essay, Flying Saucers, and you get into it more, and those will be in my notes. To sort of wrap this up, you say it's a new balance because we've lost our inner life.
It is, and the last thing Jung talks about in the UFO chapter is about a series of pictures, and he says at the end, the most important opposites in these pictures is the vertical and the horizontal.
Yeah.
And the heaven and earth. And I think we've had such a focus on heaven, and in the last 500 years, we've had such a focus on earth. And now it's time to bring the two back into some kind of harmony. And I think that's the deeper thing that's going on underneath these difficulties. And Jung saw it in his work on UFOs and the pictures that people were producing. He saw this intention, unconscious intention, to find this healing again between heaven and earth and other polarities as well. But again, it's paradox. We need to hold a paradoxical view upon these complementary opposites in order to do our bit to help them find some kind of union.
This was everything I was hoping for and looking for and waiting for, Dr. Matthews. Thank you so much for you put that so brilliantly. This is a very powerful episode for me, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity, really.
Please visit the website speakingofjung.com for more information on everything discussed in this episode and to access all of our previous episodes, available to stream or to download for free. Speaking of Jung is also available on YouTube podcasts, which you can access by subscribing to our channel, Jungian Laura. It's free. Just click the subscribe button below. This podcast is made possible by the revolutionary new dream tracking app, Temenos Dream. Discover the hidden meaning of your dreams using symbolism, literature, and mythology. Use the built-in AI illustrator and dream interpreter, and share your dreams with others, all within the app. Download it by clicking on the link on the episode page or in the description box below, and set up a free account today. I created Speaking of Jung over 8 years ago as a free podcast. All of our content is still free to access, but it is not free to produce. Please visit our support page on our website at speakingofjung.com/support to learn about the myriad ways you can help keep this podcast going. And our Patreon should be going live sometime this month. So with my heartfelt thanks to all of our listeners, and especially to our donors, I am Laura London, and you've been watching a very special video edition of Speaking of Jung.